In this video, I want to talk about a specific module called the General Purpose Input-Output module. Now, if you look at an Atmega 328, and I'm sure you have the Arduino boards, so you can pick up an Arduino board and just take a look at the big IC on one of the edges of the Arduino board. Now, this IC is the Atmega 328. It's a 28-pin IC, and there are various pins associated, pins on the IC, right? Now, of course, a few of these pins are dedicated. So, for example, there are power supply pins for a 5 volt and a 0 volt supply. But most other pins can be used as what is called the general purpose input output, which means that you can use these pins to input some quantities into the microcontroller, or you can use these pins to output out of the microcontroller. When we are talking about input output, we are talking about digital input output, not analog input output. In Later in the lecture, we are going to look at the analog to digital converter module, and we'll see how analog signals can be inputted in the microcontroller. But for now, we are talking about digital signals, which means that you're inputting a 0 or a 1 and you're outputting a 0 or a 1. Okay, so uh, just to repeat, so if you have a pin on the microcontroller, so let me just kind of draw one side of a microcontroller, and here's one pin. Let me call it pin 1. Okay, this pin can act as an input or as an output. What controls whether this pin acts as an input or an output? The thing that controls this is the a register in the microcontroller, and this register is called the data direction register. Okay, the data direction register, and in short we can call it DDR. And because this is associated with pin 1, let me call it DDR1. So when DDR1 is 0, this pin acts as an input, and when DDR1 is set to 1, it acts as an output. Okay, fairly straightforward. It's like pressing a switch. So you have this pin which can act both as an input and output. You press the switch, you make it 1, it starts acting as an output. You take away the press, so 0, the pin starts acting as an input. Okay, but there is more to it, right? Because if the pin is an output, how do you write an output to the pin? Does that make sense? So pin 1 is acting as an output, but you need some data to be written. So let's say I want to write a 0 on the pin. How do I write a 0 on the pin? Okay, so the way I write 0 on a pin is by using another register. So whatever is stored in this register is outputted when the pin is set as an output. Okay, so that register is called port. Okay, port 1 for the pin number. And similarly, you have another register called the pin for port input, P for port and IN for input, port input 1, which when the pin is set as an input, it takes the value that appears on the input and stores it in that register so that you can use it in the program. So let me kind of summarize all that I'm saying once more. So what I'm saying is there are 3 registers associated with the general purpose input output pin. One is the data direction register, DDR, and if you set DDR as 0, your pin acts as an input, and if you set it as a 1, it acts as an output. In addition, you have a port. So when you have your pin acting as an output, you want the data to be written to the pin. You want to write either a 0 or 1 from the pin and send it outside the microcontroller. So how do you do that? You do that by writing to a port, to a register called port. Okay, and when you are reading inside, you're taking a data value from outside and you're reading it, you're inputting it into your microcontroller, you need to store it somewhere. So where are you going to store it? You store it in pin. Okay, so if you have a microcontroller and here's a pin, here's our pin 1, and you have set it as an input, so let's set it as input. So how do you set it as an input? You say ddr1 equal to 0. Okay, and once you have done that, now you want to find out what is the input that you're reading. You want to find out what the value of the input is. I say, is it a 0 or is it a 1? So what are you going to do? You're going to look at the register called pin 1. And if pin 1 is 0, that means the input that you are receiving at the microcontroller pin 1 is a 0. If it is 1, it is 1. Okay. Now, if I set this pin as an output, how do I do that? I'll do that by selecting DDR1 and making it 1. Now, something has to be output there, right? I want to output a 0 or a 1. So I decide I want to output 1. So how am I going to do that? Easy. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to take this register port 1 and say port 1 equal to 1. So as soon as port 1 becomes 1, uh, the data which is in port 1 is pushed out at pin 1.